Well, as I alluded to before our intermission, the Council of Trent adopts from a new religious order the idea to better train its priests. And they adopt this from the Society of Jesus, or the Jesuits. The Jesuits would rigorously academically train their priests to answer questions brought about by the reformers. The man pictured here is St. Ignatius of Loyola, who was the founder of the Jesuits. St. Ignatius was a soldier, and he had a conversion experience. He got injured into a battle, and basically he liked to read the dirty magazines of the day before he would go into battle. Well, after his injury, he was being healed at a family member's house, and she did not have any of these magazines for him to read. She had Lives of the Saints. So he began to read these Lives of the Saints, and he has a conversion experience. He writes the Ignatian spiritual exercises, which continues to guide the Jesuits to this day. The Jesuits were also some of the leading missionaries to the New World, and especially in areas around Asia. By the end of the Council of Trent, there was clearly a Protestant part of Europe and a Catholic part. If we were to look at a map, it seems to be the farther you get away from Rome and Italy, the more likely you are to be a Protestant. For example, England, very far away, is Protestant. Most of the Scandinavian countries, very far away, are Protestant. Northern Germany is Protestant. You get down to the southern parts of Germany, they are Catholic. So it's almost, how close you were to Rome almost determined whether or not you were going to remain Catholic or become a Protestant. Both sides, that is Protestant and Catholics, were firmly entrenched into their beliefs and clinged onto these beliefs more and more as time went on. In addition, the rhetoric on both sides of this debate was really not conducive to any talks of reconciliation. What was claimed as Catholic was de-emphasized by the Protestants and vice versa. So this is where we can list some of those things that we traditionally think of Catholic and things we traditionally think of Protestant. So Catholics we traditionally would emphasize good works. The Protestants would emphasize faith. Catholics, we emphasize sacred tradition. Protestants would emphasize sacred scripture, or the Bible. We as Catholics emphasize Mary and the saints. The Protestants generally do not. So each side would more emphasize what they thought was their side of an argument as time went on. We also have, unfortunately, a lot of brutal wars in this time in Europe between Protestants and Catholic. The reforms of the Council of Trent formed the direction of the Catholic Church for the next 400 years. The Latin Mass, which was essentially unchanged from Trent to the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s, the role of the magisterium, the teaching authority of the Pope and the bishops together, and they also formed a new catechism so the Church could better explain its beliefs to its followers. Over the succeeding years, the Church spreads throughout the world, Americas, Asia, and Southern Africa. Many missionaries were sent to spread the gospel throughout the world. They were most successful in the Americas, specifically Central and Southern America. And these missionary trips also caused some of the missionaries to become martyrs. While some of the missionaries followed European military expeditions, others were motivated to convert people to Christianity. The Jesuits actually were, for a while, part of the imperial court in China. They adapted Chinese dress, they learned the Chinese language, and were at first successful in converting people. However, because they did adopt so much Chinese customs, they were in some ways almost losing their Catholic identity. So they were asked to not to adapt to some of these customs, and once they did that, the imperial court of China kind of kicks them out. As time goes on, the papacy, that is the Pope, who is a secular ruler as well, loses more and more temporal authority because the papal states in Central Italy get smaller and smaller and smaller, until finally the new Kingdom of Italy absorbs them in 1870. So Italy as a unified country is actually younger than the United States. Because they are no longer really in charge of territory anymore, more recent popes have been concerned with spiritual matters because they don't have to worry about being the leader of a group of people. For example, one of the most significant documents on social justice is a papal encyclical, Rerum Novarum, that was released in the year 1891. In the year 1869, the First Vatican Council is called. It's most remembered for the idea of papal infallibility, that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra on matters of faith or morals, the statement is declared infallible. The Latin term ex cathedra basically means from the chair. The Pope is said to hold the chair of St. Peter. So when he speaks from the chair of St. Peter, the statement is declared infallible. This has actually only happened twice. The document, or the Declaration of the Immaculate Conception in the year 1854, and the Assumption of Mary in 1950. More astute members here may notice that the Declaration of the Immaculate Conception happens before the First Vatican Council. To me, that illustrates an important fact of our Catholic faith, that we don't just pull things out of thin air when something new like this is declared. It's something that already has historical established precedents. The Immaculate Conception being one, as well as the Assumption of Mary in the year 1950. So this is from the Vatican's website. It's got virtual tours of some of the great churches in Rome. This is a relief sculpture in St. Mary's Basilica with the great church of St. Mary's in Rome. This was constructed in about the year 1550. For those of you that are close up, you can see Mary here. Mary's being assumed into heaven in this sculpture. So this sculpture was created 400 years before the Church officially declares the Assumption of Mary. Once again, illustrating this idea that as Catholic Christians, we don't pull things out of thin air. There's an established historical precedence for them. The idea of the Assumption of Mary had been around for quite some time, but had never been declared as a doctrine of the Catholic Church until the year 1950. But at least from that little bas-relief sculpture there that we see from the church in St. Mary Major in Rome that was created in the 1500s or so, we know it's been around for at least 400 years before that, and we can safely assume that it was around before that as well. Yes?
Did that, about the Assumption of Mary, didn't St. Monica go looking for the tomb of St. Mary? And when she found the tomb, it was empty, and then the belief started spreading. Was the body taken, or was it assumed into heaven, or how did it happen? Was it St. Monica?
I'm not sure. To be honest with you, I'm not familiar with that story. Mm-hmm. So if that story was from the 300s, yes, it shows you that was already well before that as well. So thank you. So moving through history a little bit quickly, in the year 1958, a new pope was elected, good Pope John the 23rd. To the surprise of many, the good Pope calls another ecumenical council, the Second Vatican Council, to, in his words, open the doors of the church. He wanted the church to interact with the modern world. A new shift had appeared in the previous years concerning the modern world by various theologians and how the church interacts with the world. For years, the modern world was seen as something that the church should speak against, while newer theologians thought that the church should interact with the modern world, and the modern world could teach the church just like the church should be teaching the modern world. So one of the things that happens is the liturgy is changed, and the vernacular, or the people's language, whatever language you spoke at your home parish, was allowed. This is rather ironic because the original reason the Catholic Church used Latin was because that was the language of the Roman people. And as the church spread from east to west, the eastern part of the empire using Greek, that would have been the language that St. Paul might have used. And so the idea that the language had to become Latin so that the people could understand what was being said. So even though the church holds on to Latin far after the common people no longer speak it, it is kind of an ironic thing that the church has to move away from Latin to return the people to experience the Mass in their own native language. One of the other things the council does is it restores the ancient understanding of the role of deacon. Before this time, if you remember when we kind of chatted about St. Francis, was that the role of deacon, the ordained order of the diaconate, was essentially just a stepping stone to the priesthood. So one would be ordained as a deacon, and then sometime later would be ordained as a priest. The diaconate, the deacons, had a very defined role within the early church. And so the council looks to the past to see what are some of the things that we did in the past and how can we bring those into the modern age. The role of the deacon is one of those. Another one is the role of the RCIA process, how adults become Catholic Christians, especially unbaptized adults. Prior to this, if a Protestant would convert to Catholicism, they may have some reading time that the priest would give them the Bible, a couple things to read, and within a couple months, whenever the priest felt they were ready, they would become Catholic. Well, the ancient church used to have about a 3-year process for someone to become a Catholic Christian, culminating with the Easter Vigil Mass, where the new people were baptized into the church, received confirmation, as well as receive the Eucharist. Second Vatican Council instructs the church to look back on the old process of becoming Catholic and how can we bring that into the modern day. And that's where the RCIA process comes about. So the pontiff, the pope, is increasingly seen as an international leader, and as such has spoken out against some of the ills of the modern age. Famously, John Paul II, pictured here, or St. John Paul II, I should say, spoke out against the evils of communism and helped to bring down the Iron Curtain. You know, John Paul II met many times with Reagan, and then during these meetings, they discussed how John Paul personally experienced communism and how he really, really disliked it. And he found an ally in President Reagan who was the same way. And through the soft power of the church and through the hard power of the United States, they were able together to be able to bring down communism. I think if you would have talked to people in the 1980s and told them the Soviet Union would collapse in the next 12 or 13 years, most of them thought you would have been crazy. But in fact, through the work of the church, as well as the work of President Reagan, communism comes down.
And Margaret Thatcher.
And what?
Margaret Thatcher.
Prime Minister of, and who?
Lech Walesa.
Oh yeah, Poland. I mentioned Poland. I said John Paul II was there. So this is where this is my portion a little bit where I make a slight opinion here. The Catholic Church still struggles to this day to implement the quote-unquote spirit of the Council, the spirit of the Second Vatican Council. However, a number of good things have happened since the Vatican Council. One of them is the ecumenical movement. So the ecumenical movement is how do the churches come back together? How do Catholic and Orthodox come back together? How do some of the Protestant churches and the Catholic Church come back together? There is an encyclical. An encyclical is a very important letter written by the Pope. And this one was the encyclical letter of Ut Unum Sint by St. John Paul II. And Ut Unum Sint is that they may be one. It's a quote from the Gospel of John. And in it, the Pope lays out some of the areas that he is willing to be able to discuss with both Protestants and Orthodox to help bring unification back together. So the Catholic Church is currently in discussions with both Protestant churches as well as the Orthodox churches. And how do we bridge our understandings and how do we go about what we know are our differences and how do we come back together? Yes, George?
They don't have that kind of centralized hierarchy as we do. Can't just local Protestant churches, if, let's say, Protestants and Catholics come back together, can't they just reject that?
They could. Because, yeah, they don't have that centralized. There is, governing bodies, like there's a Lutheran Federation that speaks on behalf of the Lutherans. We have discussions with the Anglican communion, so we discuss with the Archbishop of Canterbury. But yeah, if you want to get down to more of the evangelical free churches that are very less structured than the Catholic Church, as well as the Anglican Church, the Lutheran Church, the Orthodox Church, yeah, that would be an area that yes, they would have differences in. Yeah.
How does our church talk to the fear that some Protestants have about reunification? Because I think in some Protestant denominations it's seen as a bad thing, or maybe I think in kind of end times discussions and things like that. That's one of the groundwork for those future that would bring about. And that's how I've heard it discussed. How our church needs to try to reconcile that.
I think for the most part, the Catholic Church is working with like the mainline Protestant churches. So the Anglicans, the Orthodox, the Presbyterians, those that do kind of have more of a corporate structure. And I believe the churches that espouse that are more of that evangelical free. That would, we would, as Catholics, we would have to figure out how do we get the Lutherans and us to come back together before we can worry about, I think, some of those other groups that are, for lack of a better term, kind of more on the fringe of where they're at with their theology. Those groups definitely have a lot of things different, as opposed to like maybe us and the Anglicans, or maybe us and the Lutherans. So, yeah.
So you're saying you have some opinions about how we progress?
Yes.
Well, maybe you're going to get to this,
Mhm.
but if not, I just have to throw this out. And I'm not terribly upset about it, but the diaconate movement and the deacons, my thinking is there were women deacons. And so would you say that we still have a ways to go in recognizing women in the church? Because even women whose husbands were deacons were not allowed to be deacons, and there was some pain. I knew of one woman who was terribly pained. She wanted so badly to be a deacon. So that would be one thing that's still out there that the church hasn't recognized.
The thing we have to be aware of with the diaconate is we're not sure if women deacons actually have the laying on of hands. And in the Catholic tradition, it has always been that the ordination is done with the laying on of hands through the diaconate, through the priesthood, as well as the bishop. And so there is discussion of trying to discover, looking at ancient texts and documents, were women deacons, did they have a laying on of hands? And at this point, it's inconclusive. So at this point, the church would argue that the women, yes, they were maybe called deaconesses in the Greek term. They did assist at baptisms in the ancient church because baptisms were done in the nude. And because of that, we're not quite sure. They apparently had some of the functions as a deacon, but we're not quite sure, at least from the readings that I have done, what their functions were beyond that. And that comes back to that great question of did they have the laying on of hands? So that's, I think, where we're at. There is some discussion. Last time I did look, the Orthodox Church is having that same discussion as well.
It seems like this would be a big problem with Protestant and the Catholic movement because there are a lot of women that are ministers. That would just, no wonder they don't want to. That would be a big deal.
And there's a lot of things that we have to overcome, and that is one of them as well. They have a completely different understanding of what the ordained ministry is compared to us. So we have to find some way to overcome that. But one of the things I think that's important to remember is that we have a lot in common. And one of the things that we as Catholics and we as the other Christians around us have a lot more in common with our basis understanding of Jesus Christ as our Lord and Savior. And because of that, what do we do to get out in the world to make ourselves be known as Christians? There's that old song of, they will know we are Christians by our love. And I think that's, when we have this discussion of the differences, which, I do get into in this discussion as well, it's important, I think, to remember that in some ways we have a lot more in common than we do apart. And what are some of the good things that we can do together to help people become Jesus, help them to become Christian, help them to know Jesus, to become better disciples of Jesus. And ultimately, the end goal of all this, I would hope for all of us, is to get to heaven. And that's, how do we get there? Yeah, George.
So when was for the idea with saints, was that ever de-emphasized during the Protestant Reformation?
The saints?
Like the status of saints?
Sure, yeah. Calvin, if you go to a lot of churches, especially the Calvin churches, some of these churches were built, when I talked about the church style, not Romanesque, I'm drawing a blank now. Gothic and Baroque, yes. So they built these wonderful churches with lots of stained glass windows that had stories of the saints. They had statues in the church. And when the Protestant, Reformation came about and they didn't like the idea of saints, they ripped all this down. So if you go into some churches at one time were very, very beautiful, the stained glass has been destroyed, the statues have been ripped out. So they definitely de-emphasize the work of saints in our life that we believe we have at the communion of saints. The Protestants definitely did de-emphasize that. Does that help? Cool.
Is that still de-emphasized to this day?
I think for a lot of them, yeah. Yeah. It's one of those areas that we have to kind of overcome. Tim?
Well, anytime you're asking about what do Protestants think about this, the answer to some extent is going to be they're all across the board, because there's an awful lot of Protestant denominations. We were joking, telling stories of Methodist friends when we were growing up. We used to tease our Methodist friend because he went to Fifth Avenue Methodist Church, and we asked who St. Fifth Avenue was, and he didn't have a good answer for that. But if you look at Lutheran churches, most Lutheran churches you see, particularly if it's some of the more conservative Missouri Synod, will be saints. You see a lot of St. John's, a lot of St. Paul's Lutheran churches. Methodist, some, not so much. You don't see Baptist churches dedicated to saints. So you do kind of get that. Most Episcopal churches are going to be dedicated to saints. So, with so many different blushes of Protestantism, the answer in some degree is going to be, find something you like, and you're going to find a church that's what it does in that one regard. So there is a lot of across the board, but there's no process in Protestant churches for making new saints, for recognizing. We don't make saints, for God makes saints, but for recognizing new saints. And in fact, the Orthodox don't. They kind of eschew they don't like the formal process that Rome uses. They just kind of, if it's somebody we kind of all recognize, then we kind of all recognize it.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have that. So you get quite a spectrum.
Thanks, Tim. Good. Thank you. In the year 1999, the Catholic Church and that Lutheran World Federation that kind of speaks for both Lutheran churches came to an agreement on the idea of justification and salvation. And to put it in a nutshell, a very long and boring scholarly document, the idea was basically we as Catholics would emphasize the good works portion of our faith, whereas Lutherans would emphasize the faith portion of the faith. And for 400 years or so, we never really talked to each other about what we mean by that. Well, starting with Vatican II, it's okay now to talk to our Protestant brothers and sisters, and we have this discussion and find out that, most Lutherans would agree that, yes, out of your faith, good works will flow from that faith. And as we as Catholics believe that you got to have faith in Jesus Christ. So we were really just emphasizing two separate things of the same coin. And once we sat down and figured out what we were emphasizing, we in fact were basically talking about the same thing. There's also been 12 sessions of a Catholic Orthodox International Commission dealing with the issues of the Great Schism, and the last two have dealt with the role and function of the Pope. One of the after effects of Vatican II has been the increasing role of laity within the Church. From lectors to positions of responsibility in parishes, dioceses, universities, as well as the Vatican. And so here's kind of my opinion a little bit. The ramifications of the Second Vatican Council still reverb to this day, from traditional Catholics who claim the council went too far, to liberal Catholics who claim the council did not go far enough. I would argue that there is a pendulum that swings back and forth throughout church history from conservative to liberal elements. The modern age with technology, with communication, has only accelerated the movement of the pendulum. For example, some would say that Popes Benedict, as well as John Paul II, were more conservative, whereas Pope Francis would be more liberal. Now, they're all popes, they're all Catholic, but what they're emphasizing might be a little bit different. And I would say that these two sides of the church stem from a difference of interpretation of the structure of the church. More liberal members of the church see it as a circular model, that popes, priests, bishops, deacons, theologians, lay people are on a circular model, and that they speak to each other and they learn from each other. While more conservative members of the church see it more as hierarchical. Popes speak to the bishops, who speak to the priests, who speak to us laity at the bottom of a period. However, it's important to remember that both of these models of the church are described in the Second Vatican Council document of Lumen Gentium. So both a circular model of the church as well as a hierarchical model of the church is described in Vatican II documents. So that is a model of our church. We are both. However, I think we also have to remember the original meaning of the word Catholic, which is universal. And what better way to think about this than Pope Francis and some of his first. Pope Francis is the first pope from the New World, first from outside of Europe in over 1,200 years, first to choose Francis as his papal name, as well as the first Jesuit. Now, just a little bit of table discussion here for about 5 minutes or so. What about Pope Francis has surprised you over the last few years of his papacy? What do you think of the outreach of Pope Francis to the downtrodden in society? And what can we do as a local church to help the Pope with this point of emphasis? So the Universal Church, our Universal Catholic Church, spans the globe and counts 1.2 billion people as followers. This is nowhere greater of universality is expressed other than Rome itself. Visiting the great churches, you see Americans, Latinos, Asians, Africans, Arabs, and of course, Europeans. Just be careful during communion. This is an honest-to-God story. My wife and I, as well as a couple other friends, were having Mass in the Basilica of St. Peter's. The back of the apse of the church is where they say daily Mass. And so we're sitting there praying, and the Mass is in Italian, so we're not quite sure what's going on. We got a pretty good idea because of the stand-up, sit-down, fight part. Look at the part of the Mass where we're at. And it comes time for communion. And Europeans don't make lines for anything at all, unless it's like really, really good gelato. We're sitting there praying, and you know, we in the United States have an orderly procession to go up to communion. I have never seen a nun in a full habit book off so quick to the front of that line to get communion. So she was either really, really excited to receive Jesus, which I hope it is, or that's just how they do it over there. I mean, if this lady was moving as quick as a fullback, and she would have knocked somebody out if you weren't paying attention. Full habit, just running right up the aisle. So, you know, my friends and I, we wait till the end of the Europeans to go up, and then we calmly receive communion. So if you're ever over there, just be careful during communion, otherwise you're going to get blocked by a nun with 34 on her jersey. We also must remember the other word before the Catholic Church, the word Roman. Way back in the beginning, I mentioned this guy, Augustus. And Augustus starts the era of Roman peace, the Pax Romana. As Catholic Christians, we inherit much from the old Roman world. From our structure, to Rome itself, to our many rules and regulations. The Church has survived persecutions, schism, crusades, plagues, not so good popes, the loss of territorial holdings, the 60s, and she is still here. Guided by the Holy Spirit through these dark times before and ahead, she is still here as a beacon of light to the world. We believe in a God that has revealed God's self to all and came and left the world as a simple man. God becomes incarnate during the age of Roman peace, but that peace that was on earth is only a shadow of the peace that's in heaven when hopefully we are all reunited or united with God.